It was one of those ordinary evenings that carried with it an extraordinary weight, a weight that could be felt in the air, the kind that presses down on your chest when you least expect it. The night sky above the small, quiet town had only just begun to darken, and the faint hum of traffic could be heard in the distance. The usual sounds of life were muted here in the parking lot of the ATM, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Henry Lawson, a 79-year-old retired mechanic, shuffled his feet across the cracked pavement. He wore the same weathered leather jacket he'd had for years, a relic from his younger days when he'd still worked on cars. He wasn't an old man in the traditional sense, there was still a fire behind his eyes, a toughness carved from decades of hard work. But his body had begun to betray him. The knees that used to race across a shop floor now creaked with every step, and the hands that once held wrenches and tools with ease now trembled slightly. Still, Henry was a man who had never asked for help. He'd raised 3 children on his own after his wife passed, never missing a beat, always pushing forward. In his heart, he still saw himself as the strong man he once was. As he approached the ATM, the soft glow of the machine's screen illuminated his face. He reached into his jacket pocket, feeling the familiar lump of his wallet. He knew exactly what he needed to do, withdraw some cash for the groceries and maybe a small treat for himself. He wasn't one to spend much, but tonight, he decided he'd splurge. Maybe a good steak, or a couple of beers for the weekend. Nothing too fancy. He inserted his card into the machine and punched in the numbers. The quiet click of the buttons seemed louder than usual. He wasn't nervous, though. He'd done this countless times. But there was something about tonight that felt different. He couldn't place it, but it was a feeling that gnawed at him, deep in his gut. It was then that he felt it, a presence behind him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, his body reacting to something he couldn't yet see. He turned his head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of a tall figure lingering in the shadows. The man was young, maybe in his 20s, wearing a dark hoodie and a baseball cap that obscured most of his face. Henry didn't think much of it at first. It wasn't unusual to see people hanging around late at night. But the man didn't leave. The hairs on Henry's neck prickled. He was alone in the parking lot, no one else was around, and the stores nearby had closed hours ago. The only sound was the faint hum of the ATM machine and the distant roar of a passing car. He hastily pulled the cash out of the machine, feeling a twinge of unease he couldn't shake. His fingers brushed against the cool paper bills as he slid them into his wallet. Something about the man watching him, standing so still, made him uncomfortable. And then it happened. Before Henry could react, the stranger closed the distance between them in a swift movement, grabbing him by the shoulder and pushing him back harshly against the cold metal of the ATM. The impact was jarring, but Henry's reflexes kicked in. His heart began to race, and his mind sharpened with the clarity of someone who'd learned to survive. "Give me everything," the mugger growled, his voice low and menacing. The young man's hand was tight on Henry's arm, his breath coming fast and shallow. His eyes darted around, frantic, as if he was more nervous than his appearance let on. Henry's mind raced. This was happening so quickly, but part of him wasn't surprised. Life had a way of presenting its challenges, often at the most unexpected times. Henry felt his heart beat loudly in his chest, but he didn't panic. No, he had lived through worse. He'd fought in wars, rebuilt engines, and faced countless challenges in his life. He could handle this. "Just take it easy, son," Henry said, his voice steady. "There's no need for this. Just let me go, and I'll make sure you get what you want." The mugger didn't back off. Instead, his grip tightened. Henry could feel the fear emanating from him, his desperation thick in the air. But there was something odd about this whole situation. It wasn't the typical robbery, it didn't feel like a simple, run-of-the-mill mugging. There was a hesitation, a brief moment of indecision that Henry noticed. The young man's eyes flickered to the ground for a split second, as though unsure of his next move. Henry, ever the observant one, recognized it immediately. There was something he wasn't telling him, some deeper reason for this madness. "Hey, look at me," Henry said, his voice firm, his heart still pounding but his expression calm. The mugger paused for just a second, and that was enough. In that instant, Henry made a choice. He acted. It wasn't something he thought about, it was instinct, the kind that had kept him alive for so many years. With one swift movement, he grabbed the man's wrist and twisted it, pushing the younger man's arm behind his back with surprising strength for someone his age. The mugger let out a grunt of surprise, but Henry wasn't done. The next moment was a blur of action. Henry brought his knee up, connecting sharply with the mugger's stomach. The young man gasped for air, staggering backward, but Henry didn't give him a chance to recover. He stepped forward, a surprising burst of strength coming from his weathered body, and knocked the mugger off balance. The man fell to the pavement, stunned, eyes wide with shock. Henry stood over him, panting lightly. He didn't need to ask questions. He didn't need to know why or how this had happened. He simply had to ensure it didn't happen again. "Now, you listen to me," Henry said, his voice low and steady, but full of authority. The mugger scrambled to his feet, a look of disbelief still written across his face. "I've fought wars, rebuilt machines, and survived much worse than this. You don't want to mess with me." The young man blinked, still reeling from the turn of events. He looked at Henry like he'd just encountered something he couldn't explain, something that didn't make sense. And he was right. Because the truth of the matter was, the mugger had no idea who he was dealing with. Henry gave him a final glance, a hard stare that seemed to pierce right through him. "Get out of here," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of years of life experience. The mugger hesitated, then backed away slowly, his hands raised in submission. Henry watched him turn and walk away, still shaken but more composed than he had been just moments before. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Henry stood there for a long moment, breathing deeply, trying to steady his heart. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but one thing was certain, the man who had tried to rob him had no idea who he was. Henry was more than just a 79-year-old retiree. His past was far deeper, more dangerous, and more layered than the young man could ever imagine. And the truth, well, that was something neither of them were ready for. Henry Lawson stood motionless, his back still pressed against the cold metal of the ATM. His heart was pounding, the adrenaline from the brief encounter coursing through his veins, but he didn't let it show. He didn't allow himself to falter. He had seen much worse than a mugging attempt on a quiet evening. In his youth, he had faced far darker situations, ones that could make even the toughest of men break down. But not him. Not Henry Lawson. The mugger had run off, vanishing into the shadows from which he came, leaving Henry with nothing but the lingering tension in the air. The streets were empty, save for the distant hum of a few passing cars, but it felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. For a moment, Henry allowed himself to breathe deeply. His hands, still trembling from the sudden burst of movement, slowly steadied. He hadn't expected the man to fight back, and yet, he had. There was something about the way that young man had hesitated, almost as if he had recognized something in Henry. It wasn't just fear. It wasn't just surprise at being overpowered so quickly. No, there was a flicker in the mugger's eyes that told Henry this wasn't a simple robbery. This was something deeper, something more personal. Henry shook his head, clearing the thought from his mind. He couldn't afford to dwell on it. He was no longer a young man, after all. The last thing he needed was to be caught up in some strange, unresolved mystery. But even as he thought that, the unease refused to fade. He turned back to the ATM, the screen flickering slightly as it awaited his next action. The money he had withdrawn felt insignificant now, just a detail in a larger, unfolding narrative that Henry couldn't yet understand. The only thing that mattered was the lingering question in his mind: why had the mugger hesitated? Suddenly, his cell phone vibrated in his pocket. The sharp sound broke through his thoughts like a sudden storm. He pulled it out, his fingers still slightly unsteady, and glanced at the screen. The number was unfamiliar, but something inside him made him answer anyway. "Hello?" There was a pause on the other end, a long, drawn-out silence that made Henry's pulse spike again. But then, a voice that sounded familiar, though he couldn't place it, spoke, low and steady. "Henry Lawson," the voice said, each word deliberate, as if measuring his every reaction. "You don't know me, but I know you." The words hit Henry like a slap to the face. His breath caught in his throat. His mind raced, trying to place the voice. But it was too late. He knew the weight of those words. He had heard them before, many years ago, under very different circumstances. "Who is this?" Henry asked, trying to keep his voice steady, but his heart was racing. He could feel the tension building in his chest, just as it had before the mugging. Something was wrong. This wasn't a coincidence. It never was. The voice on the other end chuckled softly, the sound cold and devoid of any warmth. "Don't pretend you don't recognize me. You've been trying to run from your past for years, Henry. But it's time to face it. The man you met tonight? He's just the beginning." Henry's mind reeled. The mugger had known something, or someone, had recognized him. But how? Why? He'd kept a low profile, tried to forget about the things he had done, the things he had been involved in before settling into the quiet life of retirement. He had erased his past as best he could. But it seemed that wasn't enough. "What do you want?" Henry asked, his voice sharp, demanding answers. He gripped the edge of the ATM, the cold metal grounding him as he tried to stay calm. "I don't want anything, Henry," the voice said, amusement creeping into the tone. "But I think you'll want something soon enough. You've been hiding for too long. And your little secret is about to come out." The line went dead, the sudden silence deafening in its wake. Henry stood frozen, his grip tightening on the phone. His mind raced, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that his past had finally caught up with him. He took a deep breath and slid the phone back into his pocket, trying to steady his thoughts. His chest felt tight, as if the weight of the years had finally come crashing down on him. He knew he couldn't ignore this. The person on the other end had made that clear. And yet, part of him wished he could. Matching the ice that had begun to settle in his chest. As he sat there, the minutes stretched on, and his mind continued to race. There were too many unknowns now. Too many people from his past starting to reappear. The phone call, the mugger, the strange words, the past was catching up with him, and it was going to drag him back into the life he thought he had left behind. The air was thick with the smell of coffee, fried food, and something far less pleasant, a lingering sense of unease. Henry stared out of the diner window, watching the few cars pass by in the dark, empty streets. The city felt miles away, but the weight of his past was never far from him. He couldn't escape it, no matter how hard he tried. It was always there, lurking, waiting for him to slip up. The old woman behind the counter had given him a sympathetic look when he walked in, but Henry didn't want her sympathy. He didn't need it. What he needed was answers. But even that felt impossible, as if the answers he sought were locked in a distant place he could never reach. "Coffee's on the house," she said, setting the mug down in front of him. "You've always been a good customer, Henry. Don't be a stranger." He nodded absent-mindedly, staring into the steaming cup of black coffee as though it held some secret. She left him alone, and for a long while, the only sounds in the diner were the low hum of the old fridge in the back and the occasional rattle of a car outside. Henry's thoughts churned, faster and faster, as he tried to make sense of the events of the past few days. The call, the mugger, and now this overwhelming sense that someone knew far more about him than they should. Someone knew things that hadn't crossed his mind in years. A part of him wanted to scream, to fight back, but the other part, the part that had lived through countless life-or-death situations, knew that was not the way forward. This wasn't about survival anymore. It was about exposure. The voice on the phone had been calm, almost too calm. It was like the person knew him intimately, as if they had followed him for years, studying his every move. But who could it be? Who in his past would have the power, the resources, to track him down after all these years? He didn't have to think long to realize the answer. There was only one group of people who had the means and the knowledge to pull off something like this, his old associates. The people he had once worked with in the shadows, people who lived in a world of secrecy, danger, and betrayal. He had left them behind when he retired, severing all ties with the underworld he had once been a part of. But you never truly leave a life like that. It follows you, no matter how far you run. Henry had been part of something much bigger than the small town he had settled in. He hadn't always been a mechanic, and he hadn't always been a father raising his kids alone. There was a time when he had been a different man, a man who had worked for an organization that operated in the dark corners of the world. His skills had been invaluable, he had been trained in survival, in combat, and in the art of getting things done when no one else could. But it was a dangerous game, one that played with lives, and Henry had had enough. After the death of his wife, he had made a decision to leave that life behind, to try to be something he could be proud of. He had become a mechanic, started a small business, and built a life that, on the surface, seemed simple and peaceful. But the past doesn't let go so easily. The diner door creaked open, and Henry looked up, his gaze narrowing instinctively. It was an old habit, checking for danger, checking for threats. But the man who entered was no threat. He was someone Henry knew well, someone who had been a part of his past, even if Henry had hoped to never see him again. "Sam," Henry said quietly, his voice thick with a mixture of surprise and caution. Sam Evans, a tall, wiry man in his mid-60s, stepped into the diner with the same deliberate, unhurried pace Henry remembered all too well. His eyes were sharp, calculating, and his face was a mask of stoicism that had been honed over decades of working in a world where emotions were liabilities. He wasn't surprised to see Henry. He probably knew Henry would be here. After all, Sam had always been good at tracking people down, especially those who wanted to be left alone. Sam slid into the booth across from Henry without asking, his eyes scanning the diner quickly before settling on Henry. The tension in the air was palpable, but neither man spoke at first. Henry took a long sip of his coffee, his hand steady despite the storm of thoughts raging in his mind. "You got a phone call too?" Sam's voice was quiet but urgent. Henry didn't answer immediately. His gaze shifted to the window, his mind racing. So it wasn't just him. Sam had received a call, too. That could only mean one thing: whoever was pulling the strings had access to everyone they knew. People from their past. People they thought were long gone. Sam leaned in, lowering his voice. "I've been getting calls all week. They know, Henry. They know everything. And now, they're coming for us." The words hit Henry like a punch to the gut. He knew exactly what Sam meant. Whoever was behind this wasn't just targeting him. They were targeting everyone who had ever been a part of that world. The world Henry had tried so hard to leave behind. Henry's eyes narrowed. "What do they want?" Sam shook his head. "I don't know. But it's not good. Whatever's coming, we're not ready for it. And the longer we ignore it, the worse it's going to get." The weight of Sam's words settled heavily in the air between them. Henry felt his chest tighten, his mind spinning with the implications. What had they gotten themselves into? What had they done all those years ago that had come back to haunt them now? "They've got someone on the inside," Sam continued, his voice low. Someone who knows everything about us. Where we've been, who we've worked with. Everything. Henry's breath caught in his throat. Who? Sam didn't answer immediately, his gaze drifting to the door of the diner as if to make sure no one was listening. He looked back at Henry, his eyes hard. I don't know yet. But I'm going to find out. And you're going to help me. Henry's pulse quickened. I don't want any part of this anymore, Sam. I'm out. I left that life behind. You can't outrun this, Henry, Sam replied, his tone hardening. They'll find you, no matter where you go. You know that. Henry looked down at his coffee, swirling it slowly as he processed Sam's words. The truth was, Sam was right. He couldn't outrun the past. He had thought he could bury it deep enough that it would never surface again. But now, here it was, creeping back into his life, just as dangerous as ever. Henry exhaled slowly, his mind made up. All right, he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet resolve. What do we need to do? Sam's lips curled into a grim smile, one that carried both relief and the recognition of the danger ahead. We get to work. We find out who's behind this and put an end to it before they can destroy everything we've built. For the first time in a long while, Henry felt the old fire stir inside him. He had tried to bury that part of himself, but it had never truly gone away. It had been waiting, quietly, for a reason to resurface. And now, it had found one. As Henry and Sam sat in the diner, the world outside seemed to fade away. The threat was real, and the danger was closing in. But Henry wasn't afraid. He had survived worse. And this time, he wasn't going to run. The game had changed, the sun had barely begun to rise when Henry Lawson left the diner. The streets were still slick with the remnants of last night's rain, and the light of the morning had not yet fully touched the world. Everything was muted, washed in shades of gray, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The fog hung low in the air, a quiet, suffocating reminder that nothing, was ever truly as it seemed. Sam had left almost as quietly as he had arrived, his departure as deliberate and calm as his entrance. Henry, however, could not shake the feeling of being followed. Even now, as he walked across the lot, his eyes darted over his shoulder, scanning the empty street. He couldn't trust anyone, not anymore. It wasn't just about the phone call or the mysterious mugger from the other night, it was about everything that had led to this moment. His past was closing in on him, and there was nowhere to hide. Ready to face the past, Henry? Sam's words echoed in his mind. The answer wasn't as simple as it had once been. For years, he had hoped he could leave that world behind, the world of lies, blood, and secrecy. But now it seemed like fate had a different plan. The people he had once known, worked with, even trusted, none of them were gone. They had just been lying in wait, patiently, until the time was right. Henry had been given no choice but to return. He had tried to push them out of his life, but the past had a way of coming back when least expected. He knew this was not the end, far from it. This was just the beginning. His truck engine hummed quietly as he made his way toward the only place he thought he could go for answers, the old safe house. It had been years since he'd been there, but it felt like the only place he could turn to now. Even as he drove, the sense of being watched gnawed at him. The feeling had never truly left since the phone call, and it was getting worse. Someone was after him. Someone wanted him back in their world. The drive took longer than it should have, his thoughts constantly interrupted by the sound of tires on wet asphalt and the rhythmic beat of his heart. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb, a place where memories lingered in the corners, where every creak and groan of the floorboard seemed to whisper his name. It was a small house tucked away on a forgotten street, isolated from the rest of the world. The kind of place you only came to when you had nowhere else to go. When you needed to disappear. As Henry pulled up to the front of the house, he parked behind a line of tall, unkempt hedges, the kind that had grown wild since he last visited. He didn't want to be seen. If anyone was watching, he needed to stay out of sight. He killed the engine and sat for a moment, letting the silence of the night settle over him. The house loomed before him, dark and silent, its windows like hollow eyes staring out into the void. Henry stepped out of the truck and walked cautiously toward the front door. His boots crunched against the gravel, each step echoing in the night air. When he reached the door, he hesitated for a moment, his hand resting on the handle. The last time he had entered this house, he had been someone else. A different man with different priorities. He was no longer that person, but the past had a way of forcing you to confront what you tried to bury. The door creaked as it swung open, and Henry stepped inside. The smell of dust and old wood hit him immediately, a scent that took him back to a time he could barely remember. He flicked on the light, the bulb flickering for a moment before settling into a steady glow. The house was just as he remembered, shabby, old, but still holding on to remnants of its former life. He moved through the house carefully, almost reverently. Each room held its own memories, some good, some bad. But they all shared one thing in common: they were all part of a life he had walked away from. Now, that life had come knocking. Henry made his way to the small office in the back, a room that had once been used for planning, for communication, for everything he had tried to leave behind. The desk was still there, cluttered with old papers, half-burned cigars, and faded photographs. He ran his fingers over the surface of the desk, moving through the memories like they were dust, trying to find the answers he knew would be there. The files. He needed the files. He dug through the drawers of the desk, searching through papers, old files, and a few scattered weapons, tools of a life he had abandoned. Finally, he found what he was looking for. A thin, leather-bound folder, frayed at the edges but still intact. He pulled it out, his hands shaking as he opened it, revealing a series of photographs and documents. The photographs were old, grainy and yellowed with age. There were faces Henry hadn't seen in years. Men and women who had once been a part of his world. Faces that were now just shadows in his mind. But one photo caught his eye. It was a group picture: Henry, Sam, and a few others standing together in front of a nondescript building. The photograph was taken years ago, but it felt like it could have been yesterday. In the center of the group was a man Henry had not thought about in a long time: Victor Moreau. The name was like a sharp knife to Henry's chest. Victor was more than just an associate. He had been Henry's superior, his mentor in the world of espionage and covert operations. Victor had taught him everything he knew. But there was a darkness to Victor that Henry had never fully understood. He was ruthless, manipulative, and his loyalty was always in question. Victor was a man who played the long game, always thinking several moves ahead. And now, Henry realized, Victor was the key to all of this. Henry flipped through the folder, his heart racing as he skimmed through the documents. There were encrypted codes, mission logs, and intel on people and places Henry had long since forgotten. But one particular sheet caught his attention. It was a recent document, dated just a few months ago. It had been sent to Henry from an unknown source, with only a cryptic message attached: "It's time to come home, Henry." The document detailed a new operation. A new mission. But it wasn't just any mission. It was one that involved people from Henry's past, people he had thought were gone, retired, or dead. But they weren't. They were all still out there, still active, still part of a world Henry had thought he had escaped. This was it. The reason behind the phone call, the mugger, and the strange series of events that had been unraveling before him. Someone, somewhere, was pulling the strings. Orchestrating a return to the life Henry had left behind. And that someone, Henry was now certain, was Victor Moreau. Henry closed the folder and sat back in the chair, his mind racing. The silence of the house was deafening, and the weight of the past hung heavy in the air. It was clear now, his past had caught up with him. There was no running anymore. It was time to face the truth. The doorbell rang. Henry's heart skipped a beat. His mind instantly went on alert. Who could it be? No one should know he was here. He stood slowly, his hand instinctively going to the gun he kept hidden beneath his jacket. Cautiously, he moved toward the door, his steps silent. He peered through the peephole, his breath caught in his throat. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a dark coat and a fedora. His face was hidden in the shadow of the brim, but there was something familiar about him, something that sent a chill down Henry's spine. Without thinking, Henry opened the door. The man stepped inside before Henry could speak. His eyes locked onto Henry's, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "I know what you're thinking, Henry," the man said, his voice low and calm. "You think you can run. But you can't. None of us can." The man reached into his coat and pulled out a piece of paper. It was a picture, old and weathered, but unmistakable. It was a photo of Henry. But this time, it wasn't the young man from years ago. This time, it was a man far older, grizzled and worn, but unmistakably him. "Victor wants you back, Henry," the man said, his voice cold. "And he'll stop at nothing to make sure you return." The room was colder than Henry had anticipated when he stepped inside the dilapidated safe house. He hadn't been back here in over 5 years, since his last run-in with the underworld. But the walls, the dusty furniture, the photographs scattered across the room, they all held memories of a life he had long since buried. Yet, even in this isolated, forgotten place, it felt like someone was still watching. Like the past was clawing its way out of the ground, dragging him back into the life he'd tried so hard to escape. The man who had knocked on his door earlier, the one with the fedora, was now sitting across from him. His name was Ray, and he had been one of Victor Moreau's most trusted men. Ray was a ghost, always moving in and out of the shadows, never staying in one place too long. He was quiet, calculating, and dangerous, a lethal combination. Henry could feel the weight of his stare, even though the man hadn't said a word since entering. Ray had delivered a message: Victor wanted Henry back. And he wasn't going to take no for an answer. "I don't have anything for him," Henry said, breaking the silence. He wasn't sure why he even bothered saying it. Ray already knew the truth. But he had to try. This wasn't the life he had wanted for his family. He had a daughter, a son. He was not going back. Ray raised an eyebrow, his lips curling slightly. "You think he cares about what you want? You think any of this is about you?" Henry's jaw tightened. "It's not about me. It's about them. About my family. And I'll do anything to protect them." Ray chuckled softly, his voice dripping with contempt. "You really think that matters to Victor? You've been out of the game for too long, Henry. You're a liability now. And the longer you stay here, the more danger you're putting your family in." The words hit Henry like a slap to the face. He knew Ray was right. Victor didn't care about his family. All that mattered to Victor was control. Power. And Henry had once been his right hand in achieving it. But Henry had walked away from that life. He had severed all ties. Or so he had thought. "What does he want from me?" Henry asked, his voice steady, though his insides were churning. He had to know the full extent of what he was dealing with. The truth was, he hadn't been entirely honest with himself. The fear, the adrenaline, it had clouded his mind. He had always known he couldn't outrun his past. But now that it was here, there was no turning back. Ray leaned forward, the shadows in the room enveloping his face. "Victor wants you back in the fold. He needs your skills, Henry. There's a job, something delicate, and he wants you to do it. No one else can." "A job?" Henry's heart raced. He hadn't been part of any operation in years. He was a mechanic now. He had a life. A family. Ray's eyes flickered, as if he could read Henry's thoughts. You think you can just walk away from all of this? You think you can live out your days as a simple mechanic, pretending none of this ever happened? It's not that easy. Henry stood up abruptly, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. I'm done with you. Done with him. Tell Victor that I'm out. I don't owe him anything. Ray's smile faded, and for the first time, Henry saw the coldness in his eyes. You don't get to make that choice, Henry. You never did. Victor doesn't take no for an answer. With that, Ray stood up, his movements quick and precise. Henry's instincts kicked in, his body readying for a fight. But Ray didn't move toward him. Instead, he turned toward the door, his back to Henry. You have two choices, he said, his voice low. You can come with me and do the job. Or you can refuse. And when you refuse, we'll come for your family. Your kids. Your life. Everything. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Henry's heart thudded in his chest, his breath shallow. The weight of Ray's words hung heavily in the air. His family. He wouldn't, let anything happen to them. Ray didn't wait for Henry to respond. He walked to the door, pausing just before exiting. You'll hear from us soon enough, he said. Victor's patient. But not forever. And with that, Ray was gone. Henry stood there, motionless, as the door clicked shut behind him. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. He couldn't go back. But what choice did he have? Victor's reach was too far. Too powerful. And now that he had threatened his children, there was no way out. Henry knew this was just the beginning. The game had changed. And he wasn't prepared for what would come next. Hours later, Henry sat at his kitchen table, staring at the phone in front of him. He had to make a choice. The weight of his decisions had never been so heavy. He knew what he had to do to protect his family, but it felt like a betrayal. To everything he had fought for. To the life he had built. But Victor's message had been clear, there was no other way. He had to return to the shadows. The phone rang, cutting through the silence like a knife. Henry's heart raced as he picked up the receiver. It was Sam. Henry, you all right? Sam's voice came through the line, strained and filled with concern. Ray came by my place too. Same message. Victor wants us back. I know, Henry replied, his voice low and heavy. But there's more. He's not just coming for me. He's coming for my kids. I can't risk them getting hurt. Sam was quiet for a moment, the gravity of Henry's words settling in. You know what this means, right? We don't get to walk away this time. Once we're back in, there's no leaving. I know, Henry said again, his voice barely above a whisper. But I have no choice. The line went silent for a long time, and Henry could hear the soft hum of the background noise on the other end. Finally, Sam spoke. We'll figure this out, Henry. We'll go to Victor. We'll do what we have to do. But we'll be ready. We'll play this game on our terms. Not his. Henry closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself a brief moment of relief. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't alone in this fight. All right, he said, taking a deep breath. Let's do this. For my family. Sam's voice softened, we'll make it out, Henry. We always do. As Henry hung up the phone, a sense of resolve settled over him. He didn't know how this would end, or if it even would. But one thing was certain, he was going to protect his family, no matter the cost. The quiet hum of Henry's truck engine was the only sound that filled the night air as he sped down the darkened road. The weight of Ray's words pressed against his chest, each syllable like a heavy stone that sank deeper into his stomach. It was as if a dark cloud had settled above him, hanging low and heavy. The choice had been made for him, but now the path ahead seemed murkier, more dangerous than ever before. It wasn't just the threat to his family that haunted him, it was the knowledge that returning to this world meant giving up everything he had built in his new life. It meant sacrificing the peace he had fought so hard to find. He had promised himself, promised his children, that he would never go back to the shadows. But as the miles stretched before him, Henry knew that sometimes promises were broken, especially when lives were at stake. He thought about Sam. A part of him had always known that Sam would come back if Victor called. There was no loyalty greater than the one forged in the fire of shared secrets, blood, and years of survival. They had lived through so much together, lived through things that no one else could understand. But now, Sam's words echoed in his mind, "We'll play this game on our terms, not his." Could they really pull this off? Could they really take on Victor, outsmart him, and protect their families in the process? The truck's tires kicked up gravel as he slowed to a stop at the edge of the woods, where an old cabin stood hidden beneath the thick cover of trees. It wasn't much, but it had been a refuge in the past, a place to lay low when things got too heated. He turned off the engine and sat for a moment, staring into the darkness. His hand was already on the door handle when his phone rang. He glanced down at the screen and saw Sam's name. "Yeah?" Henry answered, his voice rough from the adrenaline of the past few hours. "We're in," Sam said. "Victor's team is already on the move. I've set up a meeting. You're going to want to hear this." "Where?" "The usual spot. 3 a.m. Don't be late." Henry hung up the phone, his pulse quickening. He couldn't ignore the cold pit forming in his stomach. The clock was ticking, and every second that passed brought him closer to a confrontation he wasn't sure he was ready for. He grabbed his bag from the passenger seat, slipped his gun into the waistband of his jeans, and headed toward the cabin. The night was still, the only sound his footsteps crunching against the underbrush. He didn't need to be told that the game had begun. Victor had made his move, and there was no turning back now. The old cabin, 2:30 a.m. The cabin looked the same as it always had, weathered, with chipped paint and a roof that sagged under the weight of years gone by. Henry pushed the door open slowly, his instincts kicking in as he surveyed the interior. Nothing had changed, but everything felt different. The silence of the cabin seemed to amplify his every movement, every thought. Sam was already inside, sitting at a table, a bottle of bourbon in front of him. The faint scent of stale cigarettes lingered in the air. "Good to see you, man," Sam said without looking up, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. Henry nodded and took a seat across from him. "You sure about this? I don't want to drag you into something you can't handle." Sam finally looked up, his face weary but resolute. "I didn't ask you here to back out, Henry. You don't walk away from this. You can't. And you know that." His eyes were sharp, the familiar edge of his old self cutting through. "We've been on the run before. We've faced worse." Henry exhaled slowly, the weight of Sam's words settling over him. This wasn't the same person who had once been his closest ally, the one who'd been a trusted companion. This was the Sam who understood the game, who knew how to navigate the danger that Henry had tried to forget. "We don't have much time," Henry muttered. "Victor's got too much power. Too many resources." Sam leaned back in his chair, swirling the bourbon in his glass. "Victor's dangerous, no doubt about it. But he's also predictable. And if there's one thing we've always been good at, it's staying one step ahead." Henry raised an eyebrow. "Staying ahead? You think that's still possible?" Sam's smile was slow, almost eerie. "You'd be surprised how easy it is to get into the heads of people like Victor. They think they've got it all figured out. They think they control everything. But they forget that we were part of the machine once. And that's what we're going to use against him." Henry wasn't convinced. The man they were up against was ruthless, and no one, not even Sam, could promise that things would go smoothly. But Henry had learned long ago that fear and hesitation didn't have a place in their world. If he hesitated now, it would be the last mistake he ever made. The meeting with Victor's men. It was 3 a.m. when Henry and Sam arrived at the nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of town. The shadows were deep here, the streets empty, save for a few stray cars parked on the side. The building loomed ahead, a fortress in the night. Henry's hand instinctively went to his sidearm as they approached. "Remember," Sam whispered, "keep your head cool. Victor's men are everywhere. If this goes south, we'll be outnumbered." Henry nodded, his thoughts a million miles away. He wasn't just worried about facing Victor's men. He was worried about what would happen once he saw Victor again. The man had been his mentor, but he had also been a tyrant, a manipulator who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. They had been friends once, or so Henry had believed. But now, there was no loyalty left. Only enemies. As they walked through the dimly lit corridors of the warehouse, the door at the far end creaked open. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was Ray. "Glad you could make it," Ray said with a cold smile. "Victor's expecting you." The door behind him swung open wider, revealing the interior of the warehouse. The space was vast, empty, save for a few crates and large wooden beams that cast long shadows across the floor. And there, standing in the center of the room, was Victor Moreau. Henry's breath caught in his throat. The man hadn't changed. He still wore the same confident, self-assured expression, the same look that had made him so dangerous all those years ago. His eyes, however, were cold, calculating. The years hadn't softened him. If anything, they had only sharpened his edge. "Henry," Victor said, his voice smooth and familiar. "It's been a long time." Henry didn't respond immediately. His eyes scanned the room, noticing the armed guards at each corner. They were surrounded. "Victor," Henry finally said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing in his chest. "I'm not here to negotiate. I'm not doing your dirty work anymore." Victor laughed, a low, almost patronizing sound. "You think you have a choice? You've always had a choice, Henry. The problem is, you never liked the options I gave you." "I'm done with your world," Henry said, his voice hardening. Victor's gaze darkened. "We'll see about that." With a swift motion, he nodded to his men, who moved quickly, surrounding Henry and Sam. There was no escape. The heavy, metallic doors of the warehouse clanged shut behind Henry, the sound echoing through the vast, empty space. It wasn't just the noise that was deafening, it was the silence that followed. The tension in the air was thick, palpable, as if the entire world had come to a halt. Henry's eyes darted around, searching for a way out. The armed guards surrounding him and Sam were just a distraction. The real danger was standing in front of him. Victor. It had been years since he had last seen Victor, but the sight of him still sent a cold shiver down Henry's spine. The man hadn't changed. He was as calculating and cruel as ever, his sharp eyes locked onto Henry with a predatory gleam. Henry's fingers twitched, aching for his gun. But he couldn't make a move, not yet. Not until he understood what Victor wanted, what game he was playing. The last time they had crossed paths, Henry had thought he was free. But Victor had a way of drawing people back in, using their weaknesses against them. He had done it with Henry once, and now it seemed like he was doing it again. "You've gotten old, Henry," Victor said, his voice smooth and mocking. "But you're still the same. Always trying to run from your past. Always thinking you can outrun me." Henry stood his ground, his jaw clenched. "I'm not running anymore, Victor. And I'm done playing your games. Victor's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You think you have a choice in the matter? I'm not the one who's been running, Henry. You've been hiding for years, trying to convince yourself that you could leave it all behind. But I knew you better than anyone. You're still the same man I trained. And you'll always come back when I call. A surge of anger rose within Henry, but he swallowed it down. He wasn't about to give Victor the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. I'm not your puppet, Victor. You can't manipulate me anymore. Victor's gaze darkened, and for a moment, Henry thought he saw a flicker of something, resentment, perhaps. But then it was gone, replaced by his usual cold demeanor. You've always been stubborn, Victor said, stepping closer. But I'm not here to talk about your pride. I'm here to offer you a chance to make things right. You owe me, Henry. You know that. You've always known it. Henry's heart pounded in his chest as he processed Victor's words. What was he offering? A chance to make things right? Henry had no idea what that meant, but he knew one thing for sure, it wasn't going to be anything good. Victor's idea of making things right had always come with a price. I don't owe you anything, Henry said, his voice steady, though his insides were a mess. You took everything from me when you dragged me into your world. My family, my life. I lost it all because of you. Victor's expression softened for a fraction of a second, but it was a fleeting moment. He quickly regained his composure, his voice low and threatening. You lost everything because you weren't strong enough to keep it. But you still have a chance to make it right. I'm offering you a job, Henry. A way to get back in my good graces. You help me with one last operation, and I'll make sure your family is safe. I'll make sure you get the life you've always wanted. You'll be able to walk away from all of this, just like you've always wanted. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and for a moment, Henry felt his resolve falter. His family. The thought of them, his wife, his kids, being safe was almost too much to bear. He had sacrificed so much for them. And now, Victor was dangling the one thing he had always dreamed of, freedom. But Henry knew better than to trust Victor. He had seen this game before. It was a trap. No, Henry said firmly, shaking his head. I'm done with your games. I'm not going to play along this time. Victor's smile faded, and the air in the room seemed to grow colder. You think you have a choice? You think you can just walk away from this? You don't get to decide, Henry. I do. Henry's hand instinctively reached for his gun again, but this time, one of Victor's guards moved swiftly, placing a barrel to his back. Don't make this harder than it has to be, the guard said, his voice gruff. Henry didn't move, didn't flinch. His mind raced. What was Victor playing at? Why bring him here, only to offer him the impossible choice of betraying everything he had fought for? Victor's eyes never left Henry. You don't have to like it, he said coldly. But you'll do it. You always do. The guard nudged Henry forward, pushing him toward the center of the room where a table was set up, documents scattered across it. Henry's pulse quickened. This was it. This was the moment that would change everything. Victor stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Henry's face. This, he said, motioning to the documents, is the opportunity of a lifetime. You help me with this operation, and your family gets to live. You get to live. You go back to your life, like nothing ever happened. We'll erase the past, Henry. You can walk away. I'll make sure of it. Henry could feel the weight of Victor's words pressing down on him. This wasn't just a job, it was a trap. Victor was playing a long game, and Henry was the pawn. But there was no easy way out. If he said no, his family would pay the price. If he said yes, he would be back in the game, a game he had tried so hard to leave behind. Victor leaned in, his voice low and coaxing. You know what I can do, Henry. You know what I can take away from you. Your wife. Your children. Do you really want to put them at risk? Do you really want to see them suffer for your pride? The words hit Henry like a punch to the gut. He had been prepared for Victor's threats. But hearing them, seeing the cold calculation in Victor's eyes, made it all feel real again. Henry took a deep breath, his mind racing. What was the right choice? Could he really go back to this world, knowing that he would never be free? But more importantly, could he let his family pay the price for his mistakes? Henry's heart pounded like a drum in his chest as he stared at the table before him. The documents laid out in front of him were more than just paper, they were the threads that held together everything he had fought to escape. Victor's game was now fully in motion, and there was no getting out without losing something precious. The man who had once been a mentor, a father figure even, had now become the embodiment of everything Henry had despised about the life he had led. And now, Henry was faced with a choice. It was a choice that would decide not only his fate but the fate of his family. He had been given an ultimatum. Victor's voice sliced through the silence, bringing Henry back to the present. This operation, Henry, it's bigger than anything we've ever done before. And it needs someone with your skills, your expertise. You're the only one who can pull this off. Henry swallowed hard. You can't be serious. You're asking me to betray everything I've worked for, everything I've built. Victor's eyes glinted with cold calculation. I'm not asking you to betray anything, Henry. I'm offering you a chance to fix things. To make everything right. You help me now, and you'll get your life back. The one you always dreamed of. Your family will be safe. No more running. No more hiding. The words hung in the air like poison. It was everything Henry had ever wanted, but at what cost? Was he really ready to throw away the life he had built, to dive back into the darkness that had consumed him for so long? Could he live with the consequences of crossing that line again? He clenched his fists, trying to steady his breath. You can't promise me that, Victor. You can't promise me freedom. You don't know what that even means anymore. Victor's smile was cold, almost predatory. I know exactly what it means, Henry. I've given you everything you've ever needed. I've protected you. I've made you who you are. And now, I'm asking for one last favor. One last favor. The words echoed in Henry's mind, bouncing around like a trapped bird. He could feel the walls closing in on him. It was as if he was being sucked back into a world he thought he had escaped, into a nightmare that had no end. But this time, the stakes were higher. It wasn't just his own life at risk. It was his family's. I can't do it, Henry said finally, his voice steady but heavy with finality. Victor's expression darkened, his patience wearing thin. You think you have a choice? Do you really think you can walk away from this, from me, without consequences? You're still under my thumb, Henry. Always have been. Henry's mind raced. He had to think fast, but his thoughts were clouded by the weight of Victor's words. He had never truly escaped the past. No matter how far he ran, it had always followed him. And now, it had cornered him once again. Victor's hand slammed down onto the table, making Henry flinch. You will do this, Henry. Whether you like it or not. Your family's safety depends on it. And if you think for 1 second that I won't go after them, you're wrong. The room grew colder. The tension was unbearable. Henry's stomach twisted in knots, his mind screaming for a way out, but there was none. Not now. I won't do it, Henry repeated, his voice barely a whisper. Victor leaned in closer, his breath warm against Henry's ear. You don't have a choice. You never did. Before Henry could react, the guards moved quickly, grabbing his arms and forcing him to his feet. Sam, who had been silent up until this point, took a step forward, his eyes locked on Henry. There was a sadness in his gaze, one that Henry had never seen before. "Don't do this, man," Sam said softly, his voice betraying the weight of the situation. "You know we can't win this. You're already in too deep." Henry looked at Sam, his best friend, the man who had stood by him through thick and thin. Sam wasn't the enemy. Victor was. But Sam's words hit harder than any blow. They were a reminder that no matter what Henry did, the past would always be there, lurking in the shadows, ready to pull him back in. Victor's voice broke through the silence. "Take him away." The guards pulled Henry toward the back of the warehouse, away from the table, away from the only chance he had to make a decision. His head spun, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a vice. There was no escaping this. There was no running. And if he refused, Victor would make sure his family paid the price. The choices we make. The back room of the warehouse was dimly lit, and the air was thick with tension. Henry was thrown into a chair, his hands bound tightly behind him. The cold metal of the chair dug into his back, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were elsewhere, consumed by the impossible decision he had to make. Victor's footsteps echoed in the silence as he approached Henry, his shadow looming large. "This is your last chance, Henry," Victor said, his voice calm but deadly. "Do the job, and you get everything you've ever wanted. You can go back to your family. Live the life you were meant to have. But if you don't, if you defy me again, well, I'm afraid there will be consequences." Henry stared at the floor, his mind racing. He had never felt so trapped in his life. He had always been able to escape, able to outrun his enemies, his past. But now, there was nowhere left to run. Victor crouched in front of him, his cold eyes piercing through Henry. "You think you're a hero? You think you can stand up to me and win? You're nothing, Henry. You always were. You're just a tool. And now, I'm going to use you one last time." The words cut deep, but Henry wasn't sure if they were meant to hurt him or break him. Either way, they stung. "What's the plan?" Henry asked, his voice low but steady. Victor smiled. "It's simple. You help me take control of the shipment. You make sure everything goes smoothly, and I'll let you go. I'll make sure your family is safe. But if you fail, well, we both know what happens then." Henry swallowed hard. He had no choice. He knew that. But what scared him the most wasn't the mission itself, it was what would happen afterward. He couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. He couldn't undo the damage he had already caused. "All right," Henry said, his voice grim. "I'll do it." Victor's smile widened. "I knew you'd come around." But in that moment, as Henry nodded, something inside him shifted. He knew he was walking into a trap. He wasn't just betraying himself, he was betraying everything he had fought for. But there was no other choice. Not if he wanted to protect the people he loved. The room was silent again, save for the faint sounds of the guards moving around them. Henry's fate had been sealed. But what he didn't know was that this mission would lead him down a path more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. The room was silent, save for the faint sounds of distant machinery whirring and clanking outside. Henry sat in the cold, hard chair, his mind clouded with doubts, regrets, and the crushing weight of what he was about to do. He had made his choice. He had walked into Victor's world, swallowed the poison of betrayal, and now there was no turning back. He could almost hear the voices of his family, his wife, his children, calling to him, asking him why he hadn't found a way to escape this life. But the truth was, Henry hadn't known how. And now, standing on the edge of the abyss, he was about to make a decision that would change everything. Victor stood in front of him, his cold eyes boring into Henry's soul. "You've made the right choice," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Now, it's time to finish what we started." Henry's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the table in front of him, the operation laid out in meticulous detail. It was a heist, a job that would put them in direct control of an international shipment, something that would shift the balance of power in Victor's favor. And Henry was the key to it all. Victor's voice cut through the silence again. "You've been prepared for this, Henry. You've trained for this moment. You know what to do." But Henry didn't feel prepared. He didn't feel like the man Victor thought he was. He felt like a hollow shell of himself, a man who had lost everything, his morals, his integrity, his dignity. Now, the only thing left to lose was his soul. He was a tool. A weapon. And Victor was the puppet master pulling the strings. The twist no one saw coming. The plan was simple, or so it seemed. Henry had been given the blueprints. He knew exactly where the shipment would be, how to intercept it, and how to extract the contents without leaving a trace. But as the minutes ticked by, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was too clean. Too perfect. Victor was always playing a game, always one step ahead. But Henry wasn't the same man he had been before. He had learned, he had grown, and now, with every passing second, he felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him even more. He had to get out. He had to stop this. But how? It was too late. Victor's plan was already set in motion. The shipment was in transit, and they had only one window to strike. Henry was expected to follow the plan exactly, no mistakes, no hesitation. If he failed, the consequences would be too great. But there was no way he could go through with it. He couldn't live with himself if he did. Just as he was about to make a move, a voice crackled over the intercom, freezing him in place. "Henry," the voice said, low and menacing. "It's time to finish the job." Henry's pulse raced. He could hear the words clearly, but they weren't coming from Victor. They weren't coming from anyone in the room. They were coming from somewhere else. Somewhere deeper. A cold sweat broke out across his brow as the realization hit him. Victor had known this entire time. He had been watching Henry, watching him struggle, watching him second-guess. Every move, every thought had been calculated, every step planned. Victor had anticipated this. He had anticipated Henry's hesitation, his moral compass, and now it was time to use that against him. "Get up," Victor commanded, his voice calm but authoritative. "We're going to make sure this goes off without a hitch. You're going to finish the job, or your family will suffer the consequences." Henry stood, his hands shaking at his sides. He had no choice but to follow, no choice but to do what Victor wanted. The alternative was unthinkable. As they walked toward the back door, Henry's thoughts raced. There had to be a way out. There had to be something he could do. But no plan was forming. His mind was a blank. And then, the unthinkable happened. The escape. Just as they reached the warehouse exit, a loud crash echoed through the building. The ground shook beneath their feet, and for a moment, everything stopped. The lights flickered. The alarms blared. Chaos. Henry's heart leaped in his chest. This was it. His moment. The moment he had been waiting for. "Get down!" Victor shouted, pulling out his weapon. But Henry didn't follow. Instead, he ran. Without thinking. Without hesitation. He dashed for the exit, his breath ragged in his chest. The adrenaline surged, pushing him forward as his legs carried him through the darkness. He was escaping. He was free. For the first time in years, he was free. Victor's voice rang out from behind him. "You think you can run, Henry? You think you can escape? You can't outrun me. You can't outrun the past." But Henry didn't stop. He couldn't. There was no turning back now. The life he had known, the life he had been dragged back into, was over. He had to escape, for himself, for his family, for his soul. The world outside the warehouse was a blur. The sounds of gunfire and shouting faded as Henry sprinted through the alleyways, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't care. All he knew was that he had to get away. The unexpected return. As Henry neared the edge of the city, he slowed down, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His legs burned, his mind raced. He had done it. He had escaped. But as he looked around, the reality of what he had just done began to sink in. He was free, but at what cost? Victor was still out there, still watching, still pulling the strings. Henry knew he couldn't stay hidden forever. He would have to fight back. He would have to finish this, once and for all. But just as he was about to turn around, a familiar figure stepped out of the shadows. It was Sam. Sam? Henry whispered, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and disbelief. What are you doing here? I came to help, Sam said, his voice steady. I knew you wouldn't be able to do it alone. Henry shook his head, still trying to process the situation. I don't understand. You're supposed to be with Victor. Why are you here? Sam sighed. I was, Henry. I was. But not anymore. I couldn't do it. I couldn't be part of what he's doing. I had to get out. And now, I'm here to help you. For the first time in years, Henry felt something that he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. Sam, I don't know if we can stop him, Henry said, his voice uncertain. Victor's powerful. He's always one step ahead. We don't have to stop him, Sam said, his voice firm. We just need to make sure he knows we're not afraid anymore. Henry nodded, a small spark of resolve igniting in his chest. They had a chance. A real chance. They would take down Victor, together. The final lesson. As they made their way to the safe house, Henry couldn't help but reflect on the journey he had taken. The choices he had made. The mistakes. The betrayals. It had all led him to this moment. Victor had always controlled him through fear. But now, for the first time, Henry understood that fear was no longer a weapon. It was a chain. And now, he was free. The final lesson had been learned, the only way to break free from the past was to face it head-on, to confront the darkness that had once consumed him.